obviously the reason we have these meetings this time of year is LGBT plus History Month. But also with Pride Month in June, what you now have, isn't it, is a proliferation of rainbow flags. Just about everywhere to some extent. Some of it's, personally, I've walked past my local town hall. I'm quite glad that there's the contemporary Pride flag, the up-to-date Pride flag is on the front of Newham Town Hall. I prefer it to be hung next to the Palestinian flag at the moment, but there you go. That's a fight, isn't it? But the supermarkets take this up. All the loads of people in all kinds of different retail stores have lanyards on, don't they, with rainbows on. All this kind of thing. There are probably more rainbow flags about in British society than any other point in British history. And obviously, if you talk about a flag outside of a town hall, that's quite a tokenistic thing, isn't it? And it is tokenistic, but it's only tokenistic really if you separate it from some of the struggles that have got us to this place. And I want to talk about some of those this evening. Some of this is clearly just blatant market opportunism. I mean, I was quite taken aback the other year. I think it was when it was either the 50th anniversary of London Pride or it was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. One of those two things. And some supermarket had its fish counter made out with rainbow flags. It was just like this completely over the top sort of thing. Although I did see today, Martin just pointed to me that 2 humpback whales have been photographed having sex for the first time, but it turns out they were both male humpback whales. I know whales aren't fish, if anyone wanted to correct me on that. But some of this is, clearly a sense of market opportunism, if you like. Things like a Smirnoff lorry on London Pride, is quite a blatant piece of product placement sort of thing, isn't it? But I want to unpick some of this, because some of this is quite sort of pernicious, really. There have been various reports come out over the last few years. The way that some corporations they get these brilliant scores on these kind of ratings things about, LGBT plus kind of issues. 100% ratings on the Human Rights Campaign Equality Index, things like this. But it turns out that inside the US, these same companies are funding politicians who are putting forward anti-trans legislation. That kind of blatant hypocrisy, really, really foul kind of stuff. And these are big corporations, people like Walmart, CVS, the pharmacy company inside the US, and so on. There was an interesting article I read. It's written by someone in India who points out the same thing. And they said, the problem is 71% in a survey, 71% of LGBT plus people, said that they felt if they expressed their sexuality or gender in the way that they wanted, they probably wouldn't get a job. But you have these companies, flying the flag and so on. But the second point I want to make on that issue is it's all very well, isn't it, having these flags endorsing LGBT pride and so on. But if you're paying your workers crap, and if you're stopping them from joining a union, then what does that kind of thing really mean in practice? But I want to draw a line onto some of those questions. This, we can debate it, I suppose. This represents some kind of progress inside of British society, around the world, etc. But I want to draw attention to the latest British Social Attitudes survey, because I find it really very alarming. And I think it shows, really, that the kind of anti-trans campaign that there's been at the top of society, from the right, from the tabloid press, from the Tories and so on, is having an impact. And it's having an impact at the base of society. So the recent one shows, this came out last year, and it quotes, the proportion thinking someone who is transgender should be allowed to change the sex on their birth certificate has fallen by 23 percentage points, from 53% to 30%. That's since 2019. Another example, at the same time, the proportion who characterise themselves as not at all prejudiced against people who are transgender has fallen from 82% to 64%. That is a big dip in those figures, very serious, because if you go back through it, the general trajectory since the early 80s, when they first started doing the surveys, is a continual improvement in those figures. And actually, if you look at other questions of oppression, racism, homophobia, sexism, the British Social Attitudes Survey, it does a sort of introductory comment piece, talks about a general revolution in attitudes for the history of the history of the time it's been doing the survey. A near revolution in attitudes, it says. This is a long way, isn't it, from, you think back to 2016 and before. There was a bit of a sense of an idea of a kind of long march to progress, because you had the introduction of same-sex marriage. Things were actually moving forward for trans and non-binary people in general terms, in legalistic terms, and all the rest of it. David Cameron was able to present himself as a kind of face of, an ally of LGBT people, bringing in same-sex marriage and all the rest of it. And what does this mean in practice? Because the figures are frightening. Obviously, it goes hand in hand with an increase in hate crime, all those kind of things that we'd expect. We know, don't we, that it means more murders, like the horrific murder of Brianna Jai, and all of these kind of things. And I think we have to ask ourselves why is this happening? And we see sort of general progress and then this shift. And the first answer to that is, I think we get a very real sense in Britain in 2024, don't we? Think about the events this last week, of that feeling of divide and rule coming from the Tories. Figures like Suella Braverman and all the rest of it. Attacks on refugees, the question of small boats, now the question of Islamophobia, and part of that through this period has been attacks on trans people. And we're just seeing a kind of turbocharging of questions of Islamophobia, which expressed in things like targeting of Sadiq Khan and all the rest of it, have a much deeper effect in society, and so on. And of course, some of this is about the question of Tories fighting for their position in the Tory party, future of the Tory party, all these kind of things. But of course, it is also about divide and rule. And I think that it's no coincidence, really, that the Tories in 2016, they bring in new anti-strike legislation, which is about holding back the possibilities of strikes. What do we see last year? We see the biggest wave of strikes for 30 years. There is a sense in which the Tories look into the future. They see the possibilities of wider strike action. They act to hold it back, and they bring in more of this kind of divide and rule kind of stuff. And I want to draw attention to the fact that there is another period in which the British Social Attitudes Survey reflects this kind of thing, what we've just seen. That is the 80s. And it happens, it's general improvement, again, over questions of LGBT rights and so on. In the early 80s, you have, what do you get? You get the offence AIDS the gay plague, don't you? That's what is on the front page of the tabloid newspapers as AIDS HIV emerges. 1987, Thatcher makes her speech at the Tory party conference, which talks about how disgusting, well, really, she shouldn't use the word disgusting, but she says, children should be taught traditional moral values. Instead, they're being told it's all right to be gay. And you get the introduction of Section 28 in 1988. And again, this is done on the back of, this period of an offensive by the right-wing press and so on over AIDS and attacks on gay people and so on. But obviously there is a fight back, isn't it? And this evening is about celebrating struggle as well. And if we look back to that period of the 80s, you have, probably everyone in this room has seen the film Pride, I would imagine. But it's a very important moment because two people that are under attack by the Tories find unity, and it's important, isn't it? Lesbians and gay support the miners, take solidarity to the South Wales coalfield. That is then reciprocated with the miners leading off the Pride March in 1985, but it has bigger repercussions. It's a bit like Stonewall. This isn't the only thing happening. This isn't the only reason things move in the trade union movement. However, this helps things to move in the trade union movement. It's the NUM, it's the miners' union, whose votes are crucial to moving forward pro-LGBT policy at the TUC conference and subsequently, because of that, at the Labour Party conference. It's an important moment. There were other things, right? There's an important tiny little strike in 1974, I think it is, in Tower Hamlets, where a social worker gets done for what was then called cottaging, procuring sex in a public toilet. It's a police officer, it's entrapment, it's a case of entrapment. He gets sacked from his job in Tower Hamlets Council. They organise a strike, and he gets reinstated. There's stuff going on. That's very important to say. You have these big sort of moments, these important things where you can identify the shift that takes place, but there are also lots of smaller struggles, if you like. That's the case with Stonewall, as I said, as well. And really what I want to argue is that the biggest gains for LGBT plus people have always come at the high points of struggle, and that they're often tied to the development of socialist organisation and the wider left. So let's go back to the first identifiable LGBT plus rights organisation in human history. It's Magnus Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee, catchy name for a campaign, in 1897. Its development is tied very, very closely to the development of the German SPD, which is where you find revolutionaries, people would have heard of, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, people like this. And in fact, the SPD is very, very good at supporting the aims of Hirschfeld, supporting repeal of the homophobic legislation, paragraph 175, supports Oscar Wilde, for example. Really quite interesting stuff. But we also have to explain, don't we, why it is that this can happen inside Germany, but within 40 years, and think about that. It's now 50 years. It's now more than 50 years since Stonewall happened, isn't it? And so on. So in less time than that, within 40 years inside of Germany, you can have the first gay LGBT plus rights organisation, but then you can have thousands and thousands of people who die wearing the pink triangle in the concentration camps, inside of the same nation state of Germany. And of course, we have to talk about important questions like, why the German Revolution fails in that period. Here I want to remark as well, again, another example, the most important example in some ways of how these two questions are tied together is the experience of the Russian Revolution. Because in the Russian Revolution, workers make a revolution and, the Bolsheviks decriminalise homosexuality. They do that 50 years before that happens inside of Britain. Right? Tony Bloody Blair took 6 years to repeal Section 28 when he was in power. It took them a matter of months to decriminalise it, and part of that's because of what's going on, the deeper things that are taking place inside of society, and so on. Then I wanted to reflect on Stonewall. We identify Stonewall, don't we, as the birthplace of the modern LGBT plus movement. It is a riot. It's a riot against police repression. It lasts across 4 nights. It's led by Black and Latinx trans women. Noel Halifax, who's like the SWP's GLF the GLF in Britain, Gay Liberation Front in Britain, veteran sort of thing, he always makes this point, that if you look at who was at Stonewall, they're very disrespectable types, if you like. They're mostly poor people, they're probably homeless. It's very much of the streets, a very powerful moment in American history. But it doesn't emerge just in and of itself, does it? Just like that out of nowhere. And you have to think about considerations of the closet here, I think, as well, don't you? And what that means for people in terms of coming out and all those kind of things. But Stonewall comes on the back of the Black Civil Rights Movement. It comes on the back of the struggle for women's liberation at the end of the 60s, and very importantly, it comes on the back of the movement against the Vietnam War. And in fact, what goes on to become the GLF directly takes its name because of the struggle against the Vietnam War. I was thinking the other day, do people know the David Bowie song Jean Genie? It's about the French poet, author and playwright John Genet. And you think about that moment at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, and John Genet he's like notorious homosexual, if people understand what I mean, of that time. And he spends time with the Palestinian Fedayeen in Jordan. This is in 1970. In the same year, as I understand it, he gets into America illegally, and he goes on tour with the Black Panthers around several university campuses, where Angela Davis is his translator from French. And in one of these lectures that he gives, he does it in drag. You get a sense, don't you, of quite what a moment that was in general terms, in terms of the politics of it. And so the Gay Liberation Front is quite anti-capitalist, and it talks about the problem being the family. It's also this kind of time where Huey P. Newton from the Panthers writes a letter on gays to the Black Panthers about taking the issues more seriously and so on. And what I want to say about this is that capitalism, in the last few minutes that I've got, is that capitalism will trap us in this cycle forever. People will make advances and then be driven back. And the ruling class will find wedge issues, won't they? There was a feeling that the right really went hard on the question of transgender people in sport, didn't they? To try and wedge open that whole argument and so on. If we allow them to get away with that, you can see how the wedge can be driven deeper, and that's, I think, we've unfortunately seen that process take place in British society. So there's a question about how you drive that back, but ultimately this will repeat itself and can see moments of intense barbarism potentially for LGBT plus people in the future, if we don't identify, not just that capitalism is problematic in the way that it treats LGBT people, flying the flag, paying them shit wages, not recruiting trans and non-binary people, all those kind of things. But not just that it's problematic in that sense, but that it is the problem. And here I just want to reflect on the whole of human history in the last few minutes. For 200,000 years, human societies, in terms of people's family relations and all these kind of things, hasn't been like this. For most of that time, society was organised as hunter-gatherer societies. It's with the development of class society and with the development of capitalism that you get this entrenchment of these roles. When Engels talks about the experience of women, the role of women, as they're pushed into the development of farming, feudalism, and so on, he calls it the world historic defeat of women, because from a relatively equal position in all sorts of human societies prior to that, women face this huge setback where they're treated as they have a diminished role, which is about sustaining the family and so on, and that's continued. And whilst really, lots of things has changed, and there are various challenges to this, and the nuclear family is something of a looser thing, if you like, these days. Single parents are more accepted. Two lesbian mothers are, that's kind of fine, isn't it? Broadly accepted, although there's all sorts of problems, I think, still with that. The majority of families are still organised, on the basis of man, woman, 2.4 children, essentially, isn't it? Why is this important to capitalism? Why is it so important that women take up that role inside of society? And it's fundamentally about how production's organised inside of the capitalist system. That capitalism saves trillions and trillions of pounds on the basis of doing this, of looking after its workforce. With industrialisation, in places like Manchester, of course, this created a huge problem for the capitalists. Firstly, capitalism was kind of, tearing the traditional family structures apart, but then it had no mechanism. Capitalism the way it developed had no mechanism for looking after and caring for new generations of workers. And that's where you get these very entrenched gender roles, but very entrenched views about sexuality as well. So I highly recommend the Beyond the Binaries pamphlet that came out last year, I think. But it goes through. There are all sorts of different societies where all sorts of different ideas about gender were accepted and so on. I won't go into the detail of that. And so for us, I think the task is that we have. I've been massively cheered to see the Queers for Palestine blocks on the Palestine demonstrations, because I think that is taking a leaf out of the Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners book. That it's about people standing up and saying, we want to identify as LGBT plus people on this demonstration. We bring our unconditional solidarity. We understand this is about the history of colonialism, British colonialism, and so on. We understand that actually British colonialism exported homophobic laws right around the globe, etc. And it is a period where you feel the need, don't you, to attempt to make those kind of links all the time. But ultimately, we have to be about deep, when we have those moments where you can feel a deep radicalisation in society, that period in 1968, 1969, 1970, and so on, 10 million workers out on strike in France, etc. We have to build the kind of organisation that can not only make the links and point in the direction of the problem being the capitalist system, but when revolutionary moments throw themselves up, that is capable of leading those movements to victory. We want to live in a world, don't we, where we don't have to have an ever-expanding alphabet of different types of gender and sexuality. We want, it to be okay to be whatever gender or sexuality that you want to be without a label necessarily. So I'll leave it there.